Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Prince William County's Historic Preservation Division's video series. My name is Nathan McDonald, and today we're going to be talking about a historic resource that might be in your very own home. You might not think about it that way, but what I have beside me are two World War II uniforms, and we'll be talking a little more about some different uniforms as we go through. But today I'll be breaking down some of what you might find on uniforms that belong to family members, friends that have been given to you over the years, and you might not be 100% sure what you're looking at. So to start with, what's beside me right now, these two are service dress jackets. They are formal uniforms. At the beginning of the war, the Army actually did kind of intend for these to be worn as everyday combat uniforms. Pretty quickly figured out the age of wearing a nice big long wool jacket was quickly fading into the past. So they had to roll out a whole new line of combat uniforms. But these stayed on for more formal occasions. So to my left here, this jacket was worn by a member of the 70th Infantry Division. Following that from the left-hand side, that was the current assignment patch, what unit the person that wore the uniform was currently assigned to. Pretty self-explanatory. On the left chest, above the pocket, we have the ribbon rack, the ribbons representing different medals the personnel had received. And then right shoulder, you would sometimes find what's called a combat patch, or a former unit that had been in combat that they had served with. In this case, this one has an unusual touch you might run into on one of yours as well. And that is a patch that shows the French tricolor and the word France. That was supposed to be issued only to Free French troops allied with the Americans, British, Soviets. However, a lot of returning GIs, they found these patches either in military stores or traded for them, and then wore them to show that they had served in combat in France, if they had only been assigned to one unit through their overseas tour. The medals, generally not worn full size with the actual medal on it. So these ribbon parts, in this case, represent the Purple Heart for injury or wounding in battle, the red with white bars for the Good Conduct Medal for serving a tour of enlistment with no disciplinary infractions, and then the final line on the top is the European, Mediterranean, Africa Theater Medal. It was not issued as a medal after the war, it was only issued as a ribbon during the war. And at the bottom is the American Defense Campaign. Now, all of these can tell you some of the story of the service member who wore that uniform. The Good Conduct Medal gives you kind of an idea, at least, of their behavior during their service. If there's not one, that's not any guarantee that they did something bad or did something horrible. A lot of times, soldiers either just weren't issued them, they kind of flew below the radar, and the kind of infraction that would lose you that medal can be fairly small things. However, this medal should be worn above, but you may find them on yours. This one, the way the pins are rusted on it, it's always been like that. That's the important thing to consider. If you look at pictures online and it shows you where different insignia is supposed to be, just because it's been moved or isn't there on your uniform doesn't mean that it wasn't or that it just wasn't put on wrong by the service member. The other thing I would point out on the European medal, as you saw, are some little bronze stars. Each of those represents an additional campaign after the first that member participated in. You can usually look those up in a unit's combat history. It will list the official Army campaigns they participated in. And you can get kind of an idea of where that service member may have served in Europe or the Pacific or overseas in general. The bottom, though, the American Defense Medal, that was only awarded to service members who had been in service prior to December 7th, 1941. It was issued in June of that year on the order of President Roosevelt, and the full-size medal would usually have a particular bronze clasp if that member had been overseas, either in the Philippines, on the open ocean with the Navy, the Coast Guard, the Marines, Midway, Pearl Harbor, Alaska, places like that. So what we can tell from this uniform, served in the 70th Infantry Division, were wounded in combat, served in at least 3, there's probably a missing star, so 4 campaigns in the European theater, and were a member of the armed services prior to December 7th, 1941. Now, one other thing we can tell is on the collars, there are the infantry cross rifles. We'll show that in close-up here in a second. The different branch insignia for the Army, engineers, infantry, artillery, armored, cavalry, will usually show up on the enlisted uniform on the collars. With the Army, it won't be with officers, it won't be a disc. It will be a separate insignia. But if we take a look over here to my right, we see some of the same insignia. We see another European theater medal, but this time we have the engineer's castle, and we also have a shooting medal. Different grades, marksman, sharpshooter, etc. And then with their qualification beneath it. In this case, rifle, but it could be pistol, it could even be artillery or recoilless rifles, mortars, support weapons. This uniform, see on the side, is 1st Armored Division with nothing on the other side. So that's kind of an overview of the service jacket. You will see them as it is with this one. They could be worn by returning service members after the war, but they're more common early and mid-war. And the next uniforms we'll show you are what you'll typically see towards the end of the war as fashion and soldiers' taste. So as fashions evolved during the war years, as well as a need to conserve materials for the war effort, the service jackets started to disappear. Men that already had them could keep wearing them. Some bought them new. They liked the longer style. But after American servicemen started serving in Europe alongside British troops, a lot of officers and men started to really like the style of the British service uniforms, the battle dress. It was shorter. It was a little bit easier to move in than that. It didn't have those big long skirts and pockets. So the Army eventually would authorize their own version of the battle dress jacket, which became known as the Ike jacket, or the Eisenhower jacket. General Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower, eventually Supreme Allied Commander in the European theater, was one of the first to adopt it. After it came out, he really liked the style. His was custom made, custom tailored, but he wasn't the only one that had them custom made. After the Army officially authorized them, there were not really any shipped to Europe for almost another year afterwards. So men would turn to private tailors to have theirs modified. This one on my left here is an example of that. It was not manufactured as a Ike jacket. If I lift that up, you can see there's a big blue strip in there where it was cut down from a service jacket and hemmed up to look like a battle dress jacket. A couple other distinctive features of this particular jacket is, again, we have a ribbon rack here with the European medal ribbon, but also the American campaign medal, as it was called. Pretty much anyone that served in the continental United States during the war, everybody, and it's certainly one of the ones that oftentimes got missed as soldiers were returning from Europe or abroad. They weren't necessarily thinking of that one. But this one we do have on the ribbon. We also have, underneath the flap there, something we don't see on really any of the other uniforms, but what's called the ruptured duck or the discharge insignia. Soldiers were authorized to keep wearing their uniforms after they were discharged, especially if they did not have any civilian clothes. Oftentimes men only wore it again for as long as it took to get home via train, boat, however they were traveling, and then would take them off and put them away and store them. Other times they'd be worn again for welcome home celebrations, victory parades, and things like that. But that indicated to military policemen, officers, transportation officials that the person wearing the uniform was no longer a soldier of the United States Army, but had in fact been discharged and was traveling on their way home. The other thing is the collar discs are artillery. And on the left shoulder, we have the ports of embarkation insignia. So you will oftentimes see commands like ports of embarkation or these service commands, which were blue and white patches that were insignias that were support units in the United States. Oftentimes, the color insignia of officers and engineers, or officers and enlisted men, for those commands will not match up. They won't be a quartermaster, they won't be a transportation corps member, they'll be infantry, they'll be artillery. Oftentimes because these units were supplied with detached men from other commands that had special skills that those particular units needed. And they got reassigned, but they were still technically artillerymen, infantrymen, engineers, etc. So this is an enlisted men's jacket. It also shows us quite clearly a laundry tag or a laundry mark. There is an excellent online database where you can search these up. They're not foolproof. It is a last initial, first letter of your last name, and then your service number, the last 4 digits of it. So if there are more digits in there, you know you have a more complete serial number, and sometimes you'll also have a first name written or stamped in there. And that can really help you narrow it down because H and a number, that's going to return you 50, 100, 200 names to choose from. And there might be some details that help you match up with family, ancestors, relatives, etc. But there also might not be. So it can help, but it also sometimes just doesn't. One of those features of historic research. So to my right, we actually have an officer's Ike jacket. This one is purpose-made, or tailor-made at least, for an officer. It has a sort of snap button system at the bottom. And if I open it up, can't really very well, there's no improvised hem inside there. For an officer's uniform, again, you can kind of get a better detail of what I've been talking about with the collar. You have 2 separate U.S. insignia, and then 2, in this case, quartermaster branch insignias. On the ribbon rack, we have, in this case, the American Campaign, the American Defense Medal, and also the Pacific Theater Medal. Would have been awarded to anyone who's served a significant amount of time within the combat zone, which could be quite broad of a particular theater. In this case, this is a second lieutenant. It's an original uniform. The insignia is tarnished a bit, but golden bars for a second lieutenant, silver for a first lieutenant. And on this sleeve, we actually do have the first of all these uniforms. You won't necessarily find them on one of yours, but this does show overseas service. Each of the short bars here represents 6 months of overseas service. There are a long diagonal stripe that represents an enlistment for an enlisted man. You won't generally see them on an officer, but if you do, that typically means they were formerly an enlisted man in the United States Army. Don't often see them, especially among soldiers that were just wartime only. Either they didn't serve long enough to receive the service stripe, or they just didn't care. They didn't notice. It wasn't told to them that they were supposed to put it on. Oftentimes, but again, not always, you will see the overseas bars. But again, that first service dress jacket I showed you where the wearer did serve overseas didn't have them. So with this in mind, we'll shift gears a little bit and we will talk a little bit about United States Navy uniforms. So for the final part, we have, to my left and right, we have 2 examples of United States Navy uniforms. The United States Navy wore far more combinations of uniforms than these. Daily working dress for officers were generally khakis without very much insignia added to them. Enlisted men, kind of a soft chamois shirt and dungaree jeans. Again, not much insignia, typically a man's name stenciled on them, and that's about it. For dress uniform wear, though, a lot of times work uniforms, combat uniforms were not kept, and what you'll have at home are dress uniforms, or uniforms that were worn returning home. And even then, there's a number of combinations for the Navy, depending on what theater you served in or the season, even. There were, for officers and enlistmen, there were white uniforms, there were dark blue uniforms, and in addition, there were gray uniforms. You see the white and blues still today, khakis as well sometimes, in addition to the working dress, camouflage uniforms. But the gray uniform is a kind of a World War II experiment. The commanding officer of the United States Navy did not like the khaki uniforms. he pushed for a alternative for officers that was more Navy. And what they came up with was gray. The officers did not really like it. It was an extra item to purchase. The Navy wasn't really providing them. So not many were worn outside of the United States or the Atlantic Theater. But there are some pictures of them being worn in the Pacific, and there are some pictures of them being worn by officers serving in combat theaters. In this case, the uniform we're looking at was made in New Orleans. It has the standard features of one of the gray service uniforms. The black buttons, which help save on metal, brass, and such for wartime production. The features of the uniform aren't really that much changed from if this was a khaki uniform. It's a fairly light cotton material. Has the shoulder boards, they snap on and off. There's a little strap underneath that hooks on. Your uniform may or may not have them. It may just have the shoulder loops for a strap to go through because they could be taken off to be washed. And in this case, they are for an ensign. One strip across the bottom in a line position. So that could be even some logistics officials, combat officers in the various divisions of a Navy ship. Pretty much anyone who's not a engineer, civil, or shipboard mechanical engineer, doctor, paymaster, is going to have the star on their shoulder boards. This one again, Navy officers and enlisted wore their campaign ribbons on their uniforms as well. In this case, the American Defense and the American Campaign Medals. So someone who's not gone overseas, but has been serving since the early days of the conflict. And for some naval officers, that would include aviation candidates or cadets who were called up for training before December 7th, 1941, as well as reservists and other service members. For the enlisted uniform, we do have kind of a typical sailor suit or sailor shirt. I'll turn it around for just a second. Does have kind of the back flap with the stars, the tracery on it. Does have a single pocket over the breast, and in this case we do have, again, the ribbons with the Pacific medal, in this case having 2 service stars in addition to the campaign ribbon. Enlisted men, you won't necessarily have anything on the sleeve. Again, different grades of the Navy, typically called, you have a rank and you have a rating. In this case, the rank is Petty Officer 3rd Class, and the rating is Motor Machinist Mate, working with boat engines, things like that. We've found them on pretty much any naval shipboard unit to do mechanical repairs and operations. So this sailor served in the Pacific. Not uncommon again to see somebody who served in the Pacific have one of these blue wool uniforms for wintertime on the west coast of the United States, or when they simply had returned from overseas service. Again, the white dress uniform looks pretty much like this, but everything that is white on this uniform would be blue on the white uniform, kind of the reverse colors. Additionally, you will also find, depending on what particular rating the service member held, which side of the uniform their insignia will be on. Anything that is non-machinery or what they call the fireman rating is the lowest sort of starting point for most engineering ratings. And then deck, which is pretty much everything else. Gunnery, bosun's mates, small boats, everything else, like I said, basically would have gone on the other sleeve. Again, there's kind of a push towards simplification as the war goes on. There are some of these gray uniforms issued in this pattern for enlisted men. They are even less popular than they are for officers, so they don't last very long. There's a very handful, small amount that I've seen over the years, and they seem to mostly have been issued within the United States to shore patrol, Navy policemen, and that's about it. So keeping that in mind, we've gone through not an exhaustive selection of World War II uniforms. There are any number of permutations of insignia, design, fashion, niche items that we haven't covered on. We've not touched on headgear or anything else as well. But hopefully, if you have something at home, World War II related, this has given you kind of a better idea of what you might have or where to look. There are a number of great resources online that you can consult, and this is hopefully giving you some of the terminology to more effectively look.